There was already tension in the air before the studio lights switched on. The atmosphere backstage buzzed with unease, and the producers exchanged hushed whispers as Elon Musk, dressed in a crisp black jacket, stood with folded arms, his expression unreadable. Opposite him, seated and scrolling through notes with theatrical nonchalance, sat the guest host of the night, a sharp-tongued veteran known for pushing boundaries. The network had brought him in for a one-night-only special on innovation and controversy. What they got was a lit fuse dangling over a pool of gasoline. From the moment the segment began, it was clear this would not be a polite exchange. The host wasted no time striking a nerve, veering away from the agreed questions to challenge Elon directly on the treatment of workers in one of his newest factories. With the cameras rolling and millions watching, he pointed fingers, not just metaphorically, but in tone, posture, and cutting insinuation. He questioned not just policies, but character, and that was when the tone of the show veered off script. Elon did not flinch. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed, and responded with the kind of brutal clarity that made it clear he would not be steamrolled on national television. What started as a pointed interview quickly spiraled into a high-stakes confrontation. Elon called out the host's hypocrisy, referencing past accusations and controversial statements the host had made over the years, digging into personal territory. It was a verbal chess match wrapped in open disdain, each move aimed at humiliating the other. The energy in the studio shifted palpably. Audience members were no longer clapping on cue, instead sitting in stunned silence, eyes darting back and forth between the two as if watching a slow-moving explosion. The control room was in chaos, with producers frantically signaling to stay on schedule while failing to mute the escalating war of egos. It became evident that this was no longer about factories, policies, or even ideology. This had evolved into a personal battle between two dominant figures unwilling to yield. Elon challenged the host's integrity, accusing him of using sensationalism for ratings while pretending to stand on moral high ground. In return, the host scoffed at Elon's ambition, suggesting his goals had less to do with changing the world and more with feeding a messiah complex. Insults laced in sarcasm flew from both ends of the table. Elon's voice grew colder, more calculated, while the host's grew louder and more animated. Neither man blinked. And yet, beneath the barbs, something more profound began to emerge. This was not just about power or ego. There was resentment, genuine frustration with each other's influence, methods, and reputations. The host jabbed at Elon's role in the decline of human connection, claiming his technology was making people lonelier, more anxious. Elon countered with a biting indictment of the media's role in amplifying fear and division, making it clear that he saw the host as a figurehead of that machinery. Neither one backed down, and the commercial break came, too late to contain the damage. By the time the cameras went dark for that short pause, both men were visibly rattled. The host ripped off his earpiece, muttering to his crew, while Elon stood up and walked to the edge of the stage, staring out into the dimmed audience with a clenched jaw. He was not going to walk away. He was going to finish what had been started. The break was only a minute, but it felt longer, as if the room itself were catching its breath. As the broadcast resumed, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to electric. Neither man had cooled off during the commercial. Instead, they returned to their seats with sharpened edges, prepared to go further, to dig deeper. What had started as an unexpected spat had become an all-out intellectual and emotional brawl under the harsh lights of live television. The host opened the second segment with a mocking tone, clearly aiming to corner Elon into a reaction. He brought up a recent controversy involving one of Elon's lesser-known ventures, accusing him of exploiting loopholes to gain unfair advantages over competitors. Elon did not hesitate. With a piercing glare, he leaned back and calmly dismantled the accusation, not only denying the claims but exposing the host's ignorance of the technical details. He spoke slowly, deliberately, each word laced with controlled rage and contempt. What followed was no longer a back and forth but a layered dissection of ideologies. Elon shifted the conversation toward innovation, progress, and the future of humanity. But instead of being inspired, the host treated Elon's vision with ridicule, painting it as reckless fantasy that ignored the lives left behind in its wake. He painted Elon as a billionaire out of touch with reality, insulated by power and ego, while real people suffered the consequences of his choices. The tension grew unbearably thick. Elon's responses lost their calm veneer. He didn't raise his voice, but the words turned sharper, the tone less patient. He fired back, exposing the host's carefully manicured public persona, highlighting moments of past failure that had been glossed over by a forgiving media. It was a calculated strike, and it landed hard. The host's smirk faltered just briefly, before he returned fire with even greater venom. Their body language said what their words couldn't. Elon's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest, while the host's brow furrowed in visible frustration. There were no laughs, no applause, just the echo of two powerful figures clawing at each other's reputations with every sentence. The audience watched in complete silence, caught in the gravity of the moment. Then came the breaking point. The host, visibly riled, accused Elon of hiding behind technology and money to avoid accountability. He challenged him directly, asking why he had never addressed certain workers' strikes publicly. Elon's response was unlike anything the viewers had ever seen from him on television. He stood up mid-segment, not to leave, but to face the audience, eyes locked on the camera. What followed was a full-throated defense of his companies, his employees, and his mission. It was unscripted, raw, and unlike any statement he had given in the past. But it wasn't just about self-defense. Elon went on the offensive again, saying, the host represented the kind of legacy media that refused to evolve, that feared being irrelevant in a world racing toward the future. He accused him of clinging to controversy not to illuminate truth, but to maintain control. It was not a shout, not a rant. It was a thunderous declaration, spoken with restrained fury. The host didn't flinch, but the studio crew behind the cameras looked visibly unsettled. They had never seen this level of ferocity, not from a guest, and certainly not from a tech mogul usually known for cryptic posts and awkward interviews. By the end of the segment, neither man looked the same. Their suits were still impeccable, their expressions still composed, but something in their posture had shifted. Both knew the exchange had crossed a line, one that could not be undone. They had entered a battlefield of principles, ego, and personal pain, and neither had emerged unscathed. As the segment closed, the cameras pulled back slightly, offering a wider view of the studio. There was no music, no rehearsed outro, just the sound of silence before the next wave was set to hit. The silence that hung between segments felt heavier than before. The host sat stiffly, staring past the camera, jaw tight. Elon remained standing, arms crossed, refusing to return to his seat. The tension no longer simmered. It boiled. This was no longer a discussion, nor even a battle of wits. It had become personal. Neither man was interested in public perception anymore. Each had a point to prove, and the show had transformed into their battleground. The moment the next segment began, the host took the gloves off. He dismissed Elon's earlier speech as nothing more than grandstanding. He accused him of manipulating narratives, using the public's fascination with progress to distract from the darker truths. The layoffs, the failed prototypes, the broken promises. His voice carried not just condescension, but fury, and it was clear this wasn't just about Elon's companies anymore. It was about Elon himself, the symbol, the disruptor, the threat. Elon stepped forward, not out of desperation, but dominance. The camera angle struggled to follow him as he stood directly in front of the host's desk, forcing an uncomfortable proximity. The air between them crackled with contempt. Elon's response came in the form of an unflinching dismantling of the host's entire career. His selective outrage, his record of punching down when convenient, and the way he built an empire on entertainment disguised as journalism. Viewers across the country watched, stunned, as the conversation spiraled into something deeper. The argument peeled back layers, most never expected to see on live television. Elon wasn't defending his empire anymore. He was defending the right to dream wildly, to fail boldly, and to build against resistance. And the host, stripped of his usual smug armor, was now visibly angry, no longer controlling the direction of the exchange. He tried to regain footing, bringing up Elon's strained family relationships and past personal controversies. It was a brutal move, the kind designed to wound beyond the professional sphere. Elon, for a split second, froze. The silence in that moment was more deafening than anything spoken. But then, instead of retreating, he turned that attack into fuel. He explained how every public failure had taught him something no textbook could, how personal scars shaped his mission, and how the loneliness of being misunderstood was a price he accepted, in exchange for pushing humanity forward. It was unfiltered, emotionally raw, and yet somehow controlled. The audience, unsure how to respond, watched as the host now looked shaken. The insult meant to cripple had instead opened a door for Elon to speak from a place of unexpected vulnerability. It changed the energy in the room, not softer, but sharper. The conversation had now touched something more primal, more real than either man anticipated. But the host wasn't finished. His pride wounded, he launched into a furious monologue about responsibility, claiming Elon's influence carried consequences too vast to be treated with such arrogance. He demanded answers, accountability, remorse. But what he got instead was a cold, unforgiving truth. Elon had never tried to be perfect. He had never claimed to be a role model. He had only ever chased the impossible, and whether the world understood or hated him for it was irrelevant. The host's voice cracked with frustration, a final attempt to wrestle back control, but the damage had been done. Elon had exposed the very foundation of the host's authority, pulling back the curtain on his methods and motivations. As the segment ended, the director's voice crackled frantically through headsets, demanding, "The feed be cut early." But it was too late. The confrontation had unfolded in its entirety, unedited, and the nation had seen it all. As the final segment began, there was no illusion of civility left. The host was visibly worn down, his face a mix of resentment and disbelief. Elon, meanwhile, had returned to his chair but sat with a calculated calm, the kind of stillness that follows a storm. No one in the studio moved. Every crew member, every spectator, was waiting to see how this war of words would end. But what happened next defied expectations. The host, determined to leave a mark, launched one last barrage. He condemned Elon's disregard for political systems, his disdain for regulation, and what he called a dangerous belief that individuals, no matter how brilliant, could be above institutions. His voice rose with passion, desperation even, painting a picture of a future dominated by men like Elon, untouchable, unregulated, and answerable to no one. Elon didn't interrupt. He let the host speak, watching him with the intensity of a man who had already made peace with the chaos. When the tirade finally ended, Elon spoke, not to the host, but to the audience. His tone was low, firm, and clear, and his words were not defensive. They were decisive. He acknowledged the weight of his influence, the breadth of his reach, but refused to apologize for the scale of his ambition. He explained, in the clearest terms yet, that progress has never come from those who waited for permission. It came from those who risked being hated. He wasn't there to be liked. He was there to do what others wouldn't. Then came the turning point. Elon turned his attention back to the host, but not with contempt. Instead, he offered a moment of brutal honesty that caught everyone off guard. he admitted that he understood. The fear of losing control, of watching institutions erode under the weight of new ideas, of not knowing what comes next. But he made it clear that fear alone could not justify standing in the way of advancement. The future was coming, with or without permission, and trying to shame it into submission would only guarantee irrelevance. The host was stunned. Not humiliated, not silenced, but visibly impacted. The verbal war had burned away the layers of ego, leaving behind two men who had finally stopped posturing. It was not peace. It was understanding. Uneasy, hard-won understanding. For the first time that night, there was no shouting, no counterattack, just silence. Heavy, thoughtful silence. The camera zoomed out slowly, capturing the two figures seated in stiff, reflective stillness. The credits began to roll, not over upbeat music, but against the raw aftermath of a televised confrontation that had shifted from personal attacks to existential questions about power, innovation, and legacy. By the time the show ended, the internet had already erupted. Viewers took sides, commentary exploded, and pundits scrambled to frame what had happened. But behind all the noise, one truth remained undeniable. Both men had walked into that studio to control the conversation, and both had walked out changed by it. For Elon, it had been more than a defense of vision. It had been a declaration of war against the gatekeepers of conventional wisdom. For the host, it had been a painful confrontation with a world that no longer bowed to traditional authority. And for the audience, it had been a front-row seat to the kind of moment that doesn't just trend, but transforms. What started as a sparring match ended in something much more human, a clash of empires, minds, and wills, one that reminded everyone watching why live television, at its most honest, is still the most dangerous place for power to speak. And this time, the future didn't blink. It stared straight into the camera and refused to be dismissed.